Our first civilian baby, born in Milwaukee, was born in 1967. From that time on, things around our house got quite busy with trying to raise a family, deal with the kids' school affairs, with their athletic involvements, trying to get a vacation now and then, trying to run a practice, trying to just grow up as a family. And to make a short story very, very short, there was a lot of activity going on around the Duffy house. And so for about 20 years in that period from 61 on to the early 80s, we really hadn't thought much about the grave situation in Epinal or France. And in 1968, my grandmother passed away, and we still visited with my Aunt Catherine often, and she'd come up to our place. And anyhow, in the early 1980s, I happened to be thinking about this situation in France. I don't know what brought it up. By then, of course, we've got 4 or 5 kids who have graduated high school, and we've got 1 or 2 in college, maybe 1 out of college. And I made the offhand comment once to my wife Helen, saying, "Gee, someday we ought to take Aunt Catherine to visit the graves." And to which my usually very wise wife replied, "When you're 75, someday is right now." Well, God bless my ever-wise wife Helen. Did that ever prove to be a great idea? When we suggested it to Aunt Catherine, she was so excited and overjoyed at the thought of being able to visit the graves of her brothers that she loved so much and missed for so long. She decided she wanted to take along her oldest great-niece, our daughter Mary Bridget, along with her as her traveling companion. And so off we go in, I think it was June of 1982, to O'Hare International Airport to fly over to Iceland and then to Luxembourg and to begin the European tour and ultimately end up at the graves of her brothers, my dad and my Uncle Eddie. We began our trip getting acclimated to the European scene by spending a few days in Luxembourg City and in Echternach, and then visiting places that were close by, like Bastogne and the memorial to the 101st Airborne that was surrounded there during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 through January 1945. We all had a very good time, and Aunt Catherine, of course, was in seventh heaven. She just had such a great time. And Catherine looked forward to visiting with the last contact that our family had with any relatives in Germany, the home of Aunt Sophie's son, Wilhelm the baker. We found him and his wife in his town of Schiffweiler, which was the town where I think my grandmother was born in 1884. Wilhelm showed us the picture of himself as a kid in his Wehrmacht tank back in 1942 and 3, and said that he was captured in a big battle in Holland and taken prisoner and sent to Idaho for the duration of the war. We found it very interesting that he was not at all interested in talking any more about the war, nor concerned the fact that we were going to visit the graves of 2 of his second cousins who were buried not too far from his own town. Perhaps he felt bad that he knew he spent a better winter in 1944 and 45 than his cousins did. We thought we'd get together with him that night, but it was the Feast of St. Boniface coming up, and he had to make all the kuchens, and they didn't really have much time for us. It was really an interesting experience, and so sadly we left, and we're aware that that was the last contact we were going to have with our relatives in Germany. And Catherine was able to root around the cemetery and find the grave of Aunt Sophie that my grandmother had corresponded with for such a long time. And so we left Schiffweiler and on to Epinal for our visit to the cemetery. And so we left Saarbrücken and drove on down to Epinal to visit the cemetery. we checked into the hotel and tried to find directions to the cemetery. We had a little trouble getting directions, even though the two words, military, cemetery, are almost the same in English as they are in French, and we found that the young people who were in the hotel staff were just not as hospitable as the people you'd find at a B&B in Ireland. Nonetheless, after much difficulty, we got our directions to the few miles down the road to the cemetery, and we arrived there on a Saturday afternoon for our first visit. When we arrived at the cemetery, the four of us were just overwhelmed with the beauty of the place, with the solemnity of the place, and just how beautiful and serene a location it was. The memorials are so elegant and tasteful. The architecture is so good and appropriate for what it was trying to honor, namely the bodies of 5,225 United States servicemen. Words really can't describe how impressed we were, how we felt about the beauty of the place, nor do we have enough pictures to depict and show adequately the real orderly beauty of the place, nor could the pictures capture the solemn ambience that the whole place seemed to convey. Anyone who's seeing this program now, and whoever intends to be at this cemetery or any other United States military cemeteries, don't just plan a half-hour visit. You need a half a day, because there is so much to absorb when you look at all these crosses and stars of David dressed right dress and lined up perfectly in any direction you look. You will experience a reaction unlike any you will have ever had in your life. I too was overwhelmed with the experience and so impressed with being there, and it was equally enhanced for me being there with my Aunt Catherine, with whom I lived during the war, and with my wife and my oldest daughter. We spent the rest of that afternoon looking, absorbing, talking, meditating on the experience we just had, and then we planned to go back to the hotel and check out and head for Switzerland the next day, where we had to end up and turn the car in later on. Well, then Dominic, the attendant, came and said to us, "Please come back tomorrow and we will have the gravestones graphited so you can take better pictures. We'll take pictures, we'll put flowers on the graves and give you better materials for taking some pictures to take back home." And so we did come back on Sunday, the next day, and is it ever a good thing? Had we not, the whole story would have ended right there. Now remember, this story is about a street sign, the sign of Rue de Frères Duffy, the street of the Duffy brothers. Had we headed out for Switzerland on Sunday morning, it never would have happened. And so we returned to the cemetery after going to Mass in French, and we checked out of the hotel, and of course there was Dominic, as promised, with the graphite in the grave so we could read them, helping us with the photographs. And indeed, it really was helpful, because now we were able to read the writing on the gravestones, which we really hadn't been able to do without the graphite being placed on there to enhance the writing. Standing at that gravesite with the grave of my father with my Aunt Catherine was a big moment for me. I was something like 47 years old at the time, and I recalled that back in 1943, here my Aunt Catherine, living in a dumpy basement apartment with my grandmother, had to take in the selfish, snotty-nosed 8 or 9-year-old, the son of her brother who had to go off to war, and whose mother had to go off and build airplanes at the Douglas plant, moving her out of her bed, making her sleep with my grandmother, which was no small sacrifice, and having to put up with me for 2 years. Till I meet that saint in heaven, I will always be grateful to her. And as any of the Duffy cousins will relate, and their children who knew Aunt Catherine would also agree, that this woman was indeed a saint, the angel of the family. We are sitting on a bench, taking one last look at this beautiful, solemn place, reliving the emotional experience we've all just gone through. We knew full well we probably would never get a chance to see this place again, and wanted to take the impression with us. We're preparing to leave, and on my last look I kind of mused out loud, "Gee, I wonder what this place was like Christmas time 1944. I wonder if there's someone I could talk to around here who could speak English and who knew what the situation was like perhaps a school teacher." Well, just then Dominic says, "Wait a minute, I know such a man." I will call him. He goes into the office, gets the phone, dials a number, and calls me into the office. Dominic has this big grin on his face as he hands me the phone, and I hear this voice on the other end of the line saying, "You must come to my home. I am an ex-GI and we must have your family here." I explained that I've got my wife, I've got my daughter, I've got my Aunt Catherine. We've got to get to Switzerland and return the car in a few days. And where are you? He says, "I live in the town of Chaumont, not too far from you. I was in the 45th Division and we want very much to see you and your family. It is important." I say, "Well, I'm not too sure where Chaumont is. Let me look at the map. Let me think about it. Let me ask the other three. I'm sure they're not really aware of the directions or what's involved in the travel, but I'll get back to you." So I pull out my map and take a look, and I realize that we're heading south and east on our way to Basel and Zurich, where the car goes, and he's straight west of us, maybe 65, 70, almost 80 kilometers. So I'm thinking, oh, gee, we really can't go there, and it's out of the way, and I don't know him, and I don't know what we're getting into, and I don't know the roads, and we've sooner or later got to get to Switzerland, and we better just pass. So I'm just about to call this young man on the phone and let him know we really can't make it, have to get on to Switzerland, and up comes this young man tooling up the road on his motorcycle, and Dominic begins to laugh. And then he says, "You're going to have to go now. You can't get out of it." "What do you mean?" says I. He says, "This is the son of the brother of the man you were just talking to. This is his nephew, Jean-Pierre's nephew, who lives on the street up from the cemetery. I'm sure he called his brother Michel to send his kid up there to tell him the Americans have to come to his home." And so here we are again at one of those pivotal moments at which point the story could have ended right here and now. I still don't know what it is that led me, but I made the decision, told Dominic to get this man back on the phone, and I talked to him and said, "Okay, we'll come. Where are you? How do we get there? Where do I meet you?" etc. Well, Dominic told us how to get there, and he said, "I will meet you in the village square. Dominic will tell you how to get there." So I said, somewhat still questioningly, I said, "Okay, we'll give a shot at it. We're on our way." And so I go back to tell Helen, Bridget, and Aunt Catherine we're going to take a little detour. We're on our way to Chaumont. Where? Chaumont, I think. Well, what's going to happen there? Who knows, says I. So off we go west on one of the French highways to where? Who knows where. And so late that Sunday afternoon finds us arriving into the city square of the village of Chaumont, and I park the car and I see standing there this diminutive young man with this particular hat on, the hat of the 45th Division with the big golden Thunderbird sitting there, and I get out of the car and he comes walking over to me and we go walking over to him, and simultaneously the tears start flowing from both of us. I've never met this guy in my life. I don't know anything about him, and we're hugging, kissing, we're both crying. Well, from this point on in the story, I have to make it very succinct and not elaborate, but there is so much there to elaborate about that I'll try and do my best. We follow him in our car to his home, and there assembled is his whole family there for Mother's Day. 3 or 4 children and their babies, and we barge in on this, and we're treated and greeted like conquering heroes. Jean-Baptiste Pierre. Jean-Pierre could speak quite good English, and some of his children could speak some, but it's a good thing we had Jean there because we would have been in the dark. Nonetheless, they were all so kind and considerate, pouring us champagne, providing us with goodies, and making us feel like we were part of the family. Jean indeed had been a member of PFC in the 45th Division. First, however, he and his wife were members of the Maquis, the French resistance, and he said that when the Americans came up from the south, I was out of a job. We figure he must have been something like 12 to 16 or 17 during the German occupation, doing all he could to sabotage the conquering Wehrmacht. And so when the Americans came, he said he was one of 57 Frenchmen that became U.S. Army troopers. Interestingly enough, he ended up in the same division as my Uncle Eddie did, the 45th Division. If Eddie was killed near Besançon, some 70 or 80 miles to the south, it must have been mid-October, early November by the time the Americans came there in his part of the woods. His wife, Andre, who provided us with the most sumptuous, delicious meals all the time we were there, was also a member of the Maquis. Well, both Jean and Andre are incredibly pushy and insistent. They move us into their home. Helen and I get their bedroom. Bridget and Ann Catherine get Sophie's bedroom. She moves out to go stay with a brother in the neighborhood. Jean and Andre end up sleeping down in their cave, the room next to the garage where he stores all that wine. And we begin 2 or 3 days of treatment better than you'd get at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. We experienced hospitality and cordiality like we have never experienced anywhere in our lives. They really made us feel they were so happy to have us in their home. He had his division and regimental books that were written about their history of their operations, and by looking at that and telling where they were around September 12th, the day my Uncle Eddie was killed, and Catherine was able to figure out that they were just about around the town of Besançon at that date. We got a lot of information about the 45th Division operations that we hadn't had prior to this time. John was wounded, actually had most of his elbow shot off, at the end of December 1944, and was treated at an American hospital behind the lines, and then was given the opportunity, if he wanted to become a U.S. citizen, get sent back to the States for complete rehabilitation and start a new life there. But he said, gee, I was a kid, and I had my girl here who was Andre, and his life was really in France, so he decided to complete the medical treatment with the United States Army Hospital and then get discharged. The reason he spoke such good English was that after the war, the United States Air Force opened up a base in his town of Chameau. I think it was Chameau Air Force Base, and he worked at that base for, 25 or 30 some odd years, up until the time that President de Gaulle closed all the American bases and had us leave France, after which then Jean-Pierre became a schoolteacher. They lived right close to a French artillery regiment that was billeted there in Chameau, and they took us over there and had us meet the commander and all the ranking officers and treated us to a, quote, reception almost at their officers' club. And we again were in the process of wining and dining like celebrities. They were so proud of their American visitors. And of course, the whole family and the French officers were most interested in the story of the 2 brothers being buried at the cemetery in Epinal. All these people knew about that cemetery and what had happened during the war in this area of France. Bartholdi, who gave the Statue of Liberty to the United States, lived around this neighborhood, although he was born in Colmar, and they have a miniature statue of that Statue of Liberty to honor the sculptor who put that together for us, and it sits now on what used to be the Chameau Air Force Base. They took us to a statue that the people of Chameau are very proud of, done by one of their sculptors after World War I to honor the war dead of both sides of the conflict. It was an expression of hope that nothing like this great war of World War I could ever happen to Europe again. Little did they know that what was going to happen in 20 some odd years from that time. I think we stayed in their home for 3 days, carrying on like royalty. We saw all of Chameau that there was to see, I think. They bought each of us specially engraved napkin rings and special bowls, the bowls from which we were supposed to drink our morning coffee like they do. And then on our last day, Jean-Baptiste, we call him Jean-Pierre, took me with him to the bank/post office. I think the 2 functions happened in the same building, where we stood very quietly in line while he got up to the counter after a little bit of a wait, and he withdrew an awful lot of French francs. He silenced me so I wouldn't comment or say a word in the bank. Later he explained to me what was happening. Then when we got back to their house, I found out what was going on. He takes this wad of cash, some $2,700 US worth of French francs that he puts in my hand, and wants us to take it back to the United States to save it for him for when he and his wife come over to attend the reunions of the 45th Division and his 157th Infantry Regiment. I don't know why I was amazed. Shouldn't everyone take it for granted that after you've known someone for 3 days you'd put almost $3,000 in his hand? Well, it just shows what a relationship we have had with this family from that time on. Well, that was in 1982 in May, and Jean and Andre did return to the States for several visits to attend their Army reunions, and they did stay with us several times. In fact, they were there for, I think, 2 of our children's weddings. Fortunately for Jean-Pierre, as soon as we got to Switzerland, we converted his French francs, which were up and down and not very strong at the time, into the good, solid Swiss francs. And then we used that cash for the rest of the trip, and then when we got back to the States, we banked his money, which we kept in an account for him that he could use when he came to the States. Well, we made our trip down to Switzerland with no problem, with my daughter Bridget driving like she'd been an Indianapolis driver as she got onto that autoroute or autobahn, whatever they call it in France. We turned the car in and had a few days to tour the country of Switzerland, which we did by train. It rained quite a bit when we were there, which the Swiss tell me is usual, and in all my attempts to see an Alp, even when we were on the Matterhorn on the train, we still never saw it because of the fog and the rain. Nonetheless, we still had a great time and marveling at all the experiences we had of the trip to the cemetery and our time in Chameau with Jean and Andre Pierre. On our last day there, we made one more futile attempt by switching trains and going to an area of the country we thought would be free of fog and rain, but we were again disappointed. Actually, we missed a train that we were trying to catch, and we went back to the station in Zurich and got off and went back to our little hotel. It was very small and a very small lobby, and we walked in and there were 3 other people there, a young couple and an older fella, and they were talking in English and talking about the things they'd seen, especially some of the battle sites where the older one had been a World War II veteran, where he had been engaged in combat during World War II. So we got to chatting and told them our story, that we'd just come back from visiting the graves of my father and Uncle Eddie and Catherine's 2 brothers, and he said, "What outfit was your father in?" I replied, "The 70th Division." He said, "What regiment?" And I had to think for a minute, and I said, the 174th. And he said, "Do you mean the 274th?" I said, Yes, that's correct." Now here comes another one of those interventions that really enhances the story we're trying to tell. He said, "Did you know that there was a history written of that regiment?" I said, "No, I didn't." He said, "Well, my next-door neighbor back in Georgia later became the CO of that 274th Infantry Regiment, and he wrote a chronicle or a story or a history about that regiment and all their activities during World War II. We're here in 1982, and I looked at him and I said, "You got to be kidding." He says, "No, Duffy, tell me what day your dad was killed." And I said, "January 7th. He says, "When I get back to Georgia, I'll look it up then, and I'll get back to you." And so we got on the bus and left Switzerland back to Luxembourg, actually to Echternach, one of our favorite towns, and then we flew out the next day and returned to the United States, dropped Aunt Catherine off at O'Hare. We went back to Madison, Wisconsin. I went back to work, and a couple of weeks passed. And then I got a phone call from the son of the people that we met in the hotel in Switzerland, and he said, "Duffy, you said your father was killed on January 7th, right?" I said, "That's right." He says, "I'm going to send you the book. There's more information in there than you want to know," which he did, and we got the book a few days later, and wow. And so there I am in Madison, Wisconsin in 1982 with the book written by Wallace Cheeves, the next-door neighbor of the man we met in the hotel in Zurich, Switzerland, The True History of the 274th Infantry Regiment of the 70th Division in World War II, Snow Ridges and Pillboxes. Here we are 37 years after my father was killed, after the telegram came, and maybe 5 or 6 years after my mother died, never knowing the story. We were amazed at this non-copyrighted book, which had a day-by-day, actually minute-by-minute account of the battles that this regiment was in, beginning in December of 1944 and on through the end of their World War II experience. And we opened up to page 99, and it reads, "The Germans opened up with everything they had," he said. "A stream of machine gun bullets came in from the front and left flank. The first burst got Taylor in the knee. While he was lying on the ground, PFC Bannon ran up to take over the gun. Before he could get to it, a bullet caught him squarely in the head. Mastrangelo, the medic, was there all the time, trying to patch them up as they were hit. When Lieutenant Duffy saw what was happening, he came up, grabbed the gun himself. He barely got his hands on the trigger when he was hit in the head and neck. PFC Mastrangelo was right in the thick of the action from beginning to end. Men were hit all around him while he was working on the wounded. He knelt right in the center of the machine gun position, completely exposed to the fire. For a while, I didn't know what to do, he told Staff Sergeant Cohn at the aid station that night. As soon as I started to help one guy, another would be hit right beside me. I sure hated to see Duffy get it. He died almost immediately. I picked him up in my arms to examine him and saw right away there was nothing I could do. He gasped weakly for water a couple of times and then just passed out. He had a brother killed over here just a couple of weeks before, too. After Duffy was hit, Sergeant Schnell saw that Mastrangelo needed help bad, so he came over to give him a hand, continued Sergeant Downing. He was trying to get the wounded out of the line of fire when the Krauts got him, too. He was hit in the throat and died right away. He fell among the guys he was trying to save. Now, later on in that story, the Sergeant Schnell part becomes really significant. The sergeant who was killed probably in the same moment that my father was killed.